The winter had started quietly enough, with small flurries that dusted the streets and made the neighborhood look like a picture from a holiday card. At first, it was beautiful. The snow glistened in the morning sun, and there was a peaceful stillness in the air. She loved that quiet at the beginning of the season, the way everything seemed softer and slower. But soon, the storms grew heavier. Snow fell in thick blankets, piling up on every street, every yard, and every sidewalk. What had been a calm winter morning quickly became a challenge. She first noticed it a few days after the first major snowstorm. She woke up one morning to find a large mound of snow pushed onto the edge of her driveway. It wasn't just a dusting or a natural drift. It was a deliberate pile, pushed there by either a plow or someone with a shovel. She frowned and shook her head. At first, she thought it was an accident. Maybe the city plow had done it while clearing the street. Or maybe a neighbor was trying to clear their own driveway and didn't realize they were creating a problem for her. She brushed it off, thinking it would only happen once. But then it happened again. After every storm, without fail, snow was piled onto her property. Some days the piles were small, easy to move with a shovel. Other days the snow was taller than she was, heavy and compacted, forming almost a wall between her house and the street. It became clear quickly that this wasn't an accident anymore. The snow wasn't just in her way. It was controlling her movements, dictating when and how she could leave her home. She tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just part of winter. Everyone had to deal with snow, after all. But soon the inconvenience became real. She couldn't park her car in the driveway without shoveling for an hour first. Trips to the grocery store took twice as long. Even getting the mail became a task, as the snow was piled around the mailbox. Each day brought more snow and more frustration. The initial beauty of winter was fading fast, replaced by a growing sense of helplessness and annoyance. She began to watch closely, trying to understand where the snow was coming from. Sometimes it looked like the plow from the main street was pushing it toward her yard. Other times it seemed like neighbors were shoveling their own driveways and sending the snow her way. Whoever was doing it didn't seem to care. It was as if her property was just a dumping ground, a place where snow could be abandoned without thought. The unfairness of it stung. She paid taxes like everyone else. Her yard was her space, and yet she felt powerless to stop the snow from taking it over. The physical work was exhausting. Each time she shoveled, her back ached, her hands grew numb, and her energy drained. She tried to be diligent, clearing a path as quickly as possible so she could get on with her day. But the snow kept coming, and with each storm, the piles grew higher and harder to manage. What was supposed to be a few minutes of work turned into a full morning of labor, and no matter how much she shoveled, it seemed to return larger and heavier than before. The mental toll was just as heavy. She felt constantly irritated, constantly on edge. Every glance out the window brought a fresh wave of frustration. She started timing her trips outside to avoid the largest piles, planning her errands around the snow, always calculating how much energy it would take to move it. It began to feel like the snow was running her life. She had never thought of herself as someone who could be controlled by a natural element. But here she was, feeling trapped in her own home by something as ordinary as winter weather. Neighbors noticed, of course. Some were sympathetic, giving her small smiles as they passed by. Others shrugged and walked on, pretending nothing was happening. She felt isolated in her struggle. The neighborhood that had once felt friendly now seemed indifferent. The snow piles weren't just a physical problem. They were a sign of neglect, a reminder that she had to face challenges alone. That sense of isolation made the cold even harder to bear. She started taking notes, almost as a form of protest against the situation. Every time snow was piled onto her property, she would jot down the date, the size of the pile, and how it affected her day. It became a ritual, something she could control in a situation that otherwise felt uncontrollable. The act of writing it down didn't make the snow go away, but it helped her make sense of it, helped her put words to the frustration that had been building inside her. As the weeks went on, the snow kept coming. Some storms were brief, leaving only a light dusting, but others dumped several inches in a single night. The piles grew so large that she sometimes had to climb over them to get to her car or shovel a path through just to reach the street. The work was relentless, and yet there was no one to complain to who seemed willing to help. Calling the city brought polite responses and promises that never materialized. Talking to neighbors brought excuses and dismissive gestures. She began to realize that she couldn't wait for someone else to fix the problem. With each storm, her frustration transformed slowly into determination. The snow had taken a lot from her time, energy, patience, but she started thinking about what she could take back. She couldn't control the weather, but she could control her response. She could no longer ignore the piles, no longer pretend it was just part of winter. She needed a plan, a way to manage the snow, and eventually, a way to use the situation to her advantage. Evening after evening, she would stand by her window looking at the tall mounds of snow. Others might see them as obstacles, but she began to see them as something else. They were a challenge, yes, but also a puzzle, a problem that needed solving. She imagined different ways of moving them, ways of redirecting them, ways of protecting her driveway and her property from further invasion. The seed of an idea was planted. If the snow couldn't be stopped, maybe it could be turned into something useful, something powerful in those quiet winter nights. While the wind howled and the streetlights reflected off the thick blanket of snow, she began to understand the larger lesson. Life sometimes dumps challenges onto you without warning or reason. You can complain, you can wait for others to fix it, or you can accept the situation and find a way to make it work for you. The piles of snow weren't just snow anymore, they were an opportunity. It was a test of creativity, patience, and resolve. It wasn't easy to think this way at first. The anger and exhaustion were heavy, and there were days when she felt like giving up. But gradually, she learned to channel her energy differently. Instead of pushing against the snow with frustration, she started planning, strategizing, and imagining. The snow, which had once felt like a prison, began to feel like a tool. Each mound became a stepping stone toward a larger plan, a way to reclaim control of her life and property. And so, the winter continued, relentless as ever. Storm after storm came and went, leaving thick blankets of snow in their wake. Yet with each pile, she became stronger, more determined, and more creative. She realized that the battle with the snow wasn't just about clearing a driveway, it was about reclaiming her sense of control, independence, and her peace of mind. The winter that had started as beautiful and calm had turned into a struggle, but it was also the beginning of something bigger. The snow piles, once symbols of frustration and unfairness, were quietly teaching her an important lesson about resilience, strategy. In turning obstacles into opportunities, the snow kept coming, relentless and heavy, and with each storm, her frustration grew. She tried to ignore it at first, telling herself it was just winter, that these things happen and everyone has to deal with it. But soon, ignoring it became impossible. The piles on her property weren't just inconvenient, they were starting to block access to her driveway, her mailbox, even parts of her yard. She realized that this wasn't about the weather anymore. It was about respect, responsibility, and the way others treated her space. The snow was piling up, and with it, a growing sense of unfairness. One morning, after yet another heavy snowfall, she decided to take action. She bundled up in warm layers, pulled on thick gloves, and stepped outside with her shovel. The snow was deep, wet, and heavy. Her breath came in short, visible puffs as she began clearing a path to the street. Each shovelful was a struggle, and every time she paused to catch her breath, she looked up at the piles surrounding her property. They seemed taller than before, almost daring her to keep going. The effort was exhausting, but she refused to give in. After hours of work, she finally cleared enough space to move her car. She felt a small sense of victory, but it was fleeting. Later that day, she noticed that the snowplow had come down the street again, pushing more snow her way. She felt a flash of anger. How could it keep happening? She had spent so much energy just clearing what was already there, only to see it replaced in minutes. It felt like a battle she could never win. She decided it was time to speak up. She went door to door, talking to her neighbors, and trying to find out if anyone else was having the same problem. Some nodded sympathetically but did nothing. Others shrugged, saying it was just part of winter and she should be patient. A few seemed annoyed that she was complaining at all. The lack of support surprised her. She had assumed that neighbors would care about fairness, about respect for each other's property, but many didn't seem to care at all. She felt alone, surrounded by snow and indifference. Determined not to be defeated, she called the local authorities. She explained the situation, telling them about the repeated snow piles and the difficulty it caused her. They listened politely, asked a few questions, and promised to send someone to look into it. But when days went by, nothing changed. The snow continued to pile up. The promises of help were empty, and she realized that waiting for someone else to solve the problem was futile. If she wanted relief, she would have to create it herself. This realization was both frightening and liberating. Frightening because it meant she was truly on her own, facing a constant physical challenge and an uncooperative neighborhood. Liberating because it also meant she had the power to decide how to respond. She didn't need permission to protect her property, to reclaim her space, or to create a plan that worked for her. She just needed to be smart, patient, and resourceful. She started observing the snow differently. Instead of seeing it only as a problem, she began analyzing how it was being moved, where it landed, and what she could do to prevent it from causing damage. She noticed that certain areas of her property were hit harder than others, and certain neighbors' shoveling habits contributed more to the problem. She started making mental notes, thinking about ways to redirect the snow or to build small barriers that would protect her driveway. Slowly, a plan began to form in her mind, but she knew that action alone wouldn't solve everything. She had to think about the bigger picture, the patterns of behavior that allowed this to happen. She realized that if she could prove how the snow piles were affecting her, she might gain support, or at least create accountability. So she began documenting everything. She took pictures of the snow piles, noted the dates and times of each storm, and wrote down every instance where her property was blocked or damaged. It was tedious work, but it gave her a sense of control in a situation that had previously felt completely out of her hands. As she documented, she also started to imagine different strategies. Some were simple, shoveling a small channel to redirect the snow, placing temporary markers to prevent plows from pushing snow onto her property. Others were more creative, using snow as insulation for delicate plants, or building small snow walls that would protect certain areas. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the snow, which had seemed like a purely negative force, could be managed, shaped, and even used to her advantage. Even as she planned, the work remained physically demanding. Shoveling snow was exhausting, especially in the cold, and some mornings she woke up with sore muscles and stiff joints. Yet each time she stepped outside, she felt a growing sense of resolve. The snow wasn't just a challenge. It was a teacher. It was teaching her patience, creativity, and resilience. It was forcing her to think ahead, to plan, to take action without waiting for others to help. There were moments of doubt, of course. Some days the snow seemed endless, the piles insurmountable. She wondered if it was worth the effort, if the frustration and physical labor were too much to bear. But each time, she reminded herself of the alternative, letting the snow control her life, letting others dictate how she could use her own property. That thought was unacceptable. She could not allow herself to be powerless. Her determination began to influence how she interacted with her neighbors. Instead of waiting for their approval or help, she focused on what she could do herself. She still greeted neighbors politely, exchanged pleasantries, and maintained a friendly presence. But she no longer relied on anyone else to solve her problem. She realized that waiting for external validation or support would only prolong her struggle. She had to be the agent of change in her own life. The repeated snowstorms also gave her time to observe patterns in human behavior. Some neighbors clearly ignored her situation, focused solely on their own needs. Others seemed unaware of the impact of their actions, and a few offered small gestures of support, which, while appreciated, were insufficient to solve the larger problem. This observation reinforced her growing belief that she needed a self-reliant solution, a strategy that did not depend on others' empathy or intervention. By the end of several weeks, she had a clearer understanding of both the problem and her options. The snow would not stop. The neighbors might not change. The city might not act. But she could respond in ways that preserved her property, reduced her daily burden, and turned the situation from purely negative into something manageable. She started to feel a sense of empowerment, a quiet strength that came from understanding the challenge and taking ownership of the solution. One afternoon, after yet another round of heavy snowfall, she stood at the edge of her property looking at the towering piles. For a moment, she let herself feel the full weight of the situation, the fatigue, the sense of isolation. Then she took a deep breath and smiled faintly. These piles, which had seemed like obstacles and punishments, were now a canvas for her plans. They were a chance to demonstrate her resilience, intelligence, and determination. The winter that had started as a series of frustrations was becoming a training ground for patience, strategy, and personal power. In those moments, she made a silent promise to herself. She would not let the snow control her life or dictate her mood. She would use it, shape it, and manage it in ways that others had not imagined. She would turn what seemed like a disadvantage into an advantage, and she would do it on her own terms. The road ahead would be challenging, but she no longer feared the work. She had discovered the first hint of a larger lesson, that even in the most frustrating and unfair situations, there is always a way to reclaim control, to take back power, and to turn obstacles into opportunities. She woke up early that morning to find the world outside blanketed in white again. Overnight, another storm had arrived, leaving the neighborhood with fresh snow and new obstacles. She pulled back the curtains and looked at the piles that had already begun forming at the edges of her driveway. Her first reaction was the familiar frustration, the sinking feeling of yet another task she had to face. But then she paused, took a deep breath, and reminded herself that this time she wouldn't react with anger. Instead, she would think. She would plan. She would turn the problem into a possibility. She stepped outside, feeling the crisp air on her face. The snow was cold, heavy, and thick. But instead of immediately grabbing her shovel, she walked around her property, examining the terrain, the patterns of snow deposits, and the ways previous piles had shifted and melted. She noticed that in some areas the snow was more compacted, almost icy, while in others it remained soft and easy to move. She began to visualize how she could manipulate these differences, thinking about small trenches, channels, and barriers she could create to direct the snow where she wanted it to go, rather than letting it dictate where it settled. For the first time, she considered the snow not just as a burden, but as a material she could work with. If she built small barriers, she could protect parts of her driveway. If she redirected runoff, she could prevent future piles from forming in the most inconvenient places. Each observation sparked a new idea. Slowly, the anger that had taken hold of her in previous weeks transformed into curiosity. She started experimenting with small moves, shifting some snow from one spot to another, observing how it reacted, learning its weight, its density, and how it could be controlled. As she worked, she realized that she had been approaching the problem entirely from the wrong angle before. Instead of seeing the snow as something to fight against, she could see it as a puzzle, a set of challenges to solve. She began marking certain areas with sticks and small flags, outlining zones where she could pile snow without blocking access, and spots where she wanted it to melt naturally without causing issues. The process was slow and meticulous, but it gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt before. Each small success encouraged her to keep thinking ahead. Her mind didn't just focus on the physical aspect of the snow. She also started thinking strategically about human behavior. She remembered the indifference of her neighbors, the unhelpful responses from the authorities, and the repeated disregard for her property. She realized that she could not depend on anyone else to change the situation. The power to solve the problem lay entirely in her hands. This awareness shifted her perspective. Instead of frustration and resentment, she felt a growing confidence. She could influence the outcome, shape the environment around her, and protect her property. She spent days testing different methods. She built small snow walls that acted as shields, dug channels to redirect runoff, and stacked snow in ways that minimized its impact on her driveway. Each experiment was a lesson in patience and observation. Sometimes her efforts failed, and the snow would collapse or drift into unwanted areas. Other times, the results were better than she expected. She documented everything carefully, taking photos, making notes, and adjusting her approach. The winter had become a classroom, and she was learning quickly. Her planning extended beyond the physical landscape. She started thinking about how she could use the documentation she was gathering to protect herself in case conflicts arose. Photos, notes, and records of snow accumulation could serve as evidence of her diligence and the repeated intrusion on her property. This idea of preparation gave her a sense of security. She was no longer at the mercy of circumstance. She was shaping the narrative, creating a foundation for accountability and fairness. Even as she became more methodical, she maintained her resilience. Early mornings spent shoveling and reorganizing snow were exhausting, yet she persisted. She learned to pace herself, to recognize when to rest and when to push forward. The physical labor was grueling, but it became a ritual, a meditative process that allowed her to focus her energy productively. She discovered that working with intention, rather than reacting impulsively, brought a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment that she had not experienced before. Her neighbors began to notice the change as well. Some were curious, watching from a distance as she moved with purpose and efficiency. Others seemed puzzled, unable to understand why she was spending so much effort on what they saw as mere snow. She did not seek approval or attention. She simply continued to act with clarity and determination. Her focus on results, rather than complaints or frustration, distinguished her from those around her. One afternoon, she paused to look at the landscape she had been shaping. The piles of snow that had once felt like obstacles now looked manageable, almost intentional. Channels she had dug were directing runoff away from key areas, and small snow walls were preventing new accumulations from creating barriers. The transformation was subtle but noticeable. She realized that she had taken control of a situation that had seemed uncontrollable, and the sense of empowerment was profound. Her thoughts turned to future storms. She considered how she could refine her methods, create more durable barriers, and anticipate the ways the snow would behave. She imagined the possibility of turning each new storm into an opportunity rather than a setback. The winter that had once felt like an endless series of challenges now became a series of opportunities to apply her skills, test her patience, and demonstrate her ingenuity in the evenings. She reviewed her notes and plans, reflecting on the progress she had made. She considered how her approach could evolve, how she could continue to adapt and improve. The snow had taught her patience, creativity, and resilience. It had forced her to think critically, plan ahead, and take responsibility for outcomes. The lessons were clear. Control what you can, prepare for what you cannot, and transform obstacles into tools. She began to notice subtle shifts in her own attitude. Frustration and resentment, which had once dominated her thoughts, were being replaced by problem-solving and strategy. She felt a quiet pride in her ability to adapt, to think creatively, and to take initiative. The snow had become more than a physical challenge. It had become a teacher, shaping not only her environment, but also her mindset. Interactions with neighbors continued, but she approached them differently. She remained polite and civil, but she no longer relied on them for solutions. Her confidence grew as she realized that she could create outcomes on her own. She learned to observe carefully, anticipate actions, and respond with calculated decisions rather than reactive emotion. This strategic approach made her feel powerful, even in the face of relentless winter storms. By the end of Part 3, she had transformed her approach entirely. The snow, once a source of frustration and helplessness, had become a challenge she could navigate, a puzzle she could solve, and a tool she could manage. The physical labor was still demanding, but it no longer felt pointless. Each shovelful, each adjustment, each small barrier contributed to a larger strategy. She had begun to turn the problem into an opportunity, laying the groundwork for even greater control and influence in the parts of her property that had once felt out of reach. The next storm came with a quiet intensity. blanketing the streets in a thick layer of snow. She had anticipated it, studied the weather reports, and prepared her tools. Unlike previous storms, she did not approach the situation with frustration. Instead, she felt a sense of readiness, a confidence born from weeks of observation, experimentation, and careful planning. The snow that fell that morning would be different, because she would approach it differently. She started early, before most neighbors had even stepped outside. She bundled up, laced her boots tightly, and picked up her shovel, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. But she did not simply begin clearing snow at random. She approached it with a plan, moving methodically through her yard, assessing the areas where snow tended to accumulate the most. She placed temporary markers, small stakes she had set up in previous weeks, to guide her actions. Each movement had a purpose, each shovelful a goal as she worked. She thought about all the knowledge she had gained over the past weeks. She remembered which areas were hit hardest by snow pushed from the street, which slopes caused runoff to flood her driveway, and how the snow responded to wind and temperature changes. Her understanding of the landscape and the snow itself allowed her to act with precision. She moved some piles strategically, leaving others in places where they would cause no harm and could even act as barriers against further accumulation. Neighbors began to notice the difference. Some watched from across the street, curious about her methodical approach. Others whispered to each other, puzzled by the way she worked. But she did not seek attention or validation. She focused solely on her own property, her own strategy, and the results she could control. She had learned that relying on others had only led to frustration. Taking initiative and responsibility for the outcome was far more powerful. By mid-morning, she had transformed her yard. The driveway was clear, channels had been dug to redirect runoff, and small snow walls shielded vulnerable areas. The piles that had once seemed overwhelming now appeared as intentional, managed formations. For the first time, she felt a sense of mastery over the snow. A quiet satisfaction in seeing months of planning and experimentation bear fruit. The physical labor was demanding, but the sense of control made it worthwhile. She did not stop there. She began thinking about the longer-term implications of her efforts. If she could manage the snow during a storm, she could also anticipate and influence future snow accumulations. She considered how she might reinforce her barriers, improve drainage, and prevent damage to her property. She began experimenting with layering techniques, compacting snow in certain areas while leaving other areas loose to encourage natural melting. Each adjustment was deliberate, a test of strategy and patience. Her approach also extended to documentation. She continued taking photos and notes, recording the results of each experiment. The visual record helped her see progress, identify patterns, and plan improvements. It also served as evidence of her diligence and effort, a silent record in case conflicts arose with neighbors or authorities. Documentation had become a tool as powerful as the shovel in her hands, a way to assert control and create accountability. As the day progressed, she realized that her efforts had changed not only the physical landscape, but also her mindset. She felt empowered, confident, and capable. The snow that had once seemed oppressive was now a medium she could work with, manipulate, and manage. Each pile became an opportunity, each shovelful a step toward mastery. The winter that had once dominated her life was now a field in which she had agency and influence. Even the interactions with neighbors had shifted. Some began asking questions, curious about her methods and the results she was achieving. Others, who had previously ignored her efforts, seemed to take note of the difference. She answered politely, but focused on action rather than conversation. She had learned that talk alone did not create change. Deliberate, consistent effort did. Her actions spoke louder than words, demonstrating competence and resolve. By late afternoon, the snowstorm had ended. She stood at the edge of her property, surveying the work she had done. The piles were organized, the driveway clear, and the barriers effective. The transformation was visible, tangible, and satisfying. She had taken control of a situation that had once seemed overwhelming, turning an obstacle into a managed challenge. The sense of accomplishment was deep and quiet, a feeling that came not from recognition by others, But from the knowledge that she had acted with purpose, intelligence, and resilience, the day was not without its challenges. The physical labor left her tired and sore, and she knew that future storms would bring new obstacles. But she also knew that she had developed a system, a strategy, and a mindset that would allow her to face whatever came next. She had learned to anticipate, plan, and execute with precision. She had learned to observe, experiment, and adjust. And most importantly, she had learned that even in situations where others seemed indifferent or unhelpful, she had the power to create outcomes and assert control. That evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The snow that had once represented frustration, helplessness, and conflict had become a medium for mastery and strategy. The challenges she faced had forced her to think critically, act deliberately, and develop resilience. She realized that the experience had not only transformed her property, but had also transformed her approach to obstacles and problem-solving in general. She began to consider the broader implications of her experience. If she could turn the snow into a manageable and even advantageous force on her property, she could apply the same principles to other challenges in her life. Observation, planning, experimentation, and deliberate action were not just strategies for winter storms. They were strategies for life. The lessons she had learned from snow, patience, and determination could be applied in countless other situations. Turning obstacles into opportunities, her confidence grew with each reflection. She realized that power was not about controlling others, but about controlling what she could, about taking responsibility for outcomes, and about turning challenges into tools for growth. The snowstorm, which had once represented external forces beyond her control, had become a canvas on which she could assert agency and creativity. In the quiet of the evening, she prepared for the next storm. She adjusted her plans, reinforced her barriers, and organized her tools. The work ahead would be demanding, but she faced it with calm determination rather than frustration. She had discovered the strength that comes from preparation, observation, and deliberate action. She had discovered that obstacles could be transformed into instruments of power, if only approached with patience, strategy, and resilience. As night fell, the neighborhood slept under the thick blanket of snow, unaware of the transformation that had taken place. Her property, once overwhelmed and controlled by external forces, now reflected her efforts, intelligence, and careful planning. The piles of snow, once symbols of frustration and helplessness, were now symbols of her agency and mastery. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction and empowerment, knowing that she had turned a challenge into an opportunity, and a source of frustration into a demonstration of skill and determination. The winter was not over, and future storms would bring new challenges. But she had learned a powerful lesson. With observation, planning, and deliberate action, it was possible to turn obstacles into tools, challenges into opportunities, and frustration into empowerment. The snow had taught her resilience, strategy, and patience, and she had applied those lessons to reclaim control over her property and her life. She had turned what once felt like an external burden into a source of strength, and in doing so, she had discovered a new sense of power and confidence. By the time the final heavy snowfall of the season arrived, she was ready. The months of careful observation, planning, and trial and error had paid off. She stepped outside into the fresh, crisp air. Shivering slightly, but feeling a sense of calm and control she had never experienced at the start of the winter, where the snow had once seemed like an uncontrollable force. It now presented a challenge she knew she could manage. She started by surveying her property, noting where snow was likely to accumulate the most. The previous storms had taught her much about the patterns and behavior of snow. She could predict with surprising accuracy where the largest piles would form and where the runoff would flow. This knowledge allowed her to act efficiently, minimizing effort and maximizing effectiveness. Each movement was deliberate, each shovelful carefully placed. She no longer felt like she was fighting the snow. She was guiding it, directing it, and shaping it to her advantage. Neighbors passing by noticed her methodical work. Some paused to watch, curious about the way she moved with purpose, rearranging the snow in a way that seemed almost artful. Others whispered to each other, puzzled and intrigued. She did not seek their approval or attention. The satisfaction she felt came from knowing she had reclaimed control over her own property. For the first time, the snow no longer dictated her life. She dictated how the snow would behave. Throughout the day, she tested new methods she had devised. Small trenches diverted runoff, preventing it from flooding her driveway. Compact walls held back future accumulations from the street. She even used some piles to shield delicate plants and garden areas from the cold. What had once been an obstacle became a tool she could manipulate. The physical labor remained demanding, but the sense of mastery made it rewarding. Each step, each shovelful was purposeful, and the results were tangible. As she worked, she reflected on how far she had come. The frustration and helplessness that had dominated her early experiences with winter were replaced with confidence and agency. She had learned patience, observation, and strategic thinking. She had learned to anticipate, experiment, and adjust. And most importantly, she had learned that even in situations where others ignored her or refused to help, she had the power to create outcomes through her own actions. Throughout the season, she had kept meticulous records, photos, notes, diagrams documenting the snow's behavior and her interventions. Now, these records served as a testament to her efforts. They provided not only proof of diligence and problem-solving, but also a source of reflection. She could look back at the early days, when the piles seemed insurmountable, and see just how much she had learned, adapted, and grown. The documentation was a reminder that persistence and careful observation can turn seemingly overwhelming obstacles into manageable challenges. Her strategy extended. Beyond the physical aspects of snow management, she began thinking about how her efforts influenced her mental state and her interactions with others. She noticed that as she gained control over her property, her confidence and patience also increased. She became less reactive, more measured in her approach to problems, and more strategic in her thinking. The lessons learned from winter's challenges were applicable not only to snow, but to many aspects of her daily life. Neighbors began to treat her differently as well. Some who had previously ignored her complaints now asked for advice, curious about how she had transformed her property. Others observed quietly, perhaps realizing that her approach was more effective than frustration or complaints. She remained courteous, but focused on her own work, understanding that while recognition was nice, the true reward came from competence, preparation, and results. Her approach demonstrated that consistent, deliberate action speaks louder than words. Even as the season ended, she maintained her routines. She continued to monitor her property, making small adjustments to ensure that runoff did not damage key areas and that remaining snow piles would not create problems in the future. She applied the principles she had learned of observation, planning, experimentation, and careful action to maintain her property in optimal condition. The snow that had once been an enemy had become a collaborator, a force she could manage and direct with skill. The experience had also changed her perspective on challenges in general. She realized that obstacles are not inherently negative. They are opportunities to learn, adapt, and grow. The snow had forced her to develop resilience, creativity, and strategic thinking. It had taught her to anticipate patterns, adjust tactics, and act deliberately, rather than reactively. In this way, the winter became more than a season. It became a teacher, imparting lessons that extended far beyond her property. By the final days of winter, she felt a sense of quiet triumph. Her property was clear, organized, and protected. The piles of snow, once symbols of frustration and helplessness, now represented mastery and strategic thinking. She had taken a situation that had seemed overwhelmingly negative and turned it into an opportunity for empowerment. Each challenge she had faced had strengthened her skills and her confidence, leaving her prepared for future obstacles in both her environment and her life. She also understood the subtle power of preparedness. The work she had done throughout the season, combined with careful observation and thoughtful planning, had allowed her to act decisively when needed. She realized that challenges are not defeated through luck or complaints, but through deliberate action, knowledge, and persistence. The snow had taught her that even when circumstances seem uncontrollable, Control can be achieved through understanding and careful effort. In the quiet evenings, as she reviewed her notes and reflected on her progress, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had transformed her approach, her mindset, and her environment. She had learned to observe, adapt, and act with purpose. She had discovered that frustration can be channeled into strategic thinking, that helplessness can be converted into action, and that obstacles can be reshaped into tools for personal empowerment. The neighborhood remained blanketed in snow. But her property was no longer a victim to the storms. She had taken the very force that had challenged her and turned it into a controlled, manageable element. The lessons of winter patience, planning, observation, resilience had become ingrained. She had discovered the value of taking initiative, the power of careful preparation, and the importance of adapting to circumstances rather than waiting for change from others. Looking back on the season, she understood that her journey was not just about snow. It was about learning to face challenges with intelligence and patience, to turn obstacles into opportunities, and to reclaim agency in situations that initially seemed beyond control. The snow had provided a unique training ground, forcing her to think critically, plan effectively, and act decisively. The results were tangible, but the lessons extended far beyond the physical landscape.